Hello, everyone, and great to be with you again for our weekly show, Palestine This Week, with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Moeen Rabbani. Moeen, as usual, it's a pleasure to see you again.
Likewise, Nassim, always a pleasure and hope you're well.
I'm fine, thank you. Had a long weekend, so after hiking a couple of mountains up north of England, I'm happy to be back, especially first thing with you discussing Palestine. And before I go on, I just want to remind our viewers to like and share our podcast. The views have been increasing, and I want to continue that trend. I mean, I'm sure you'll agree that Moin's opinions on this matter is really important. We want to get as much wide exposure of his views as possible, and I'd really appreciate it if you like our show and also share our podcast.
And
Um,
just to add, you always ask the right questions
Thank you, Moin. I
keep the
try.
discussion
So yeah, I
rich.
try. So I want to begin with three big stories from Gaza this week. First, the IPC, sorry, UN body declaring famine in the besieged territory. A new report which showed that 83% of those killed in Israel's genocide are actually civilians, and also the assassination of journalist in Nasser Hospital from yesterday. But let's begin, as I mentioned, with the humanitarian situation uh, and the determination by the IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, a UN body who decides, where famine exists and at what stage something can be classified as a famine. This is hugely significant because IPC has only declared famine four times since its establishment in 2004, and most recently in Sudan. So, Moin, I guess, I mean, my question to you would be to explain, what makes this such a rare and serious designation, and why is Israel working so hard to discredit the IPC? Of course, it's tried to discredit every single organization which
Mm.
has published reports and determined Israel's committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So we shouldn't be surprised that it's also going after the IPC. So let's begin with the classification itself.
Yeah.
Why is this so important? And also Israel's attempt to discredit the organization.
Yes, a key issue and a report that is unfortunately devastatingly important. The IPC, as you mentioned, IPC stands for Integrated Food Security Phase Classification. It's a very technical body that seeks to determine levels of malnutrition, starvation, famine from levels 1 through 5, 5 being the most severe, and acting under the auspices of the IPC is what's known as the FRC, which is the Famine Review Committee, if I pronounce that correctly. And this is the FRC or the IPC's fifth report based on FRC assessments since October 2023 as it pertains to the Gaza Strip. And what it has determined this time is that Gaza Governorate, meaning Gaza City and its environs, are now classified as level 5 famine, meaning the most severe classification available. Uh, the North Gaza Governorate is not classified because of insufficient data available to the FRC, but the FRC nevertheless concludes that it assesses that famine in North Gaza is in all likelihood as severe or worse than in Gaza Governorate. And it additionally states that Deir el-Balah and Khan Yunis governorates in the center and south of the Gaza Strip are, I believe, currently classified as level 4 and expected to reach level 5 within a matter of weeks if conditions do not change. And it also does not provide a classification for Rafah Governorate in the south of the Gaza Strip. And if I recall correctly, its reasons for doing so is its assumption that the Rafah Governorate is largely depopulated, and also that it was unable to collect information from there. And of course, as in all such reports, Israel and its apologists immediately went on the offensive. And just as they attempted to do with the whole debate over genocide, their initial pre prepared claim is that the IPC and the FRC basically rewrote the rule book, that they changed the criteria they used to make this assessment, to make Israel look bad because they're all anti Semites and the only thing they care about is blood libel and all the rest of it. Well, if you go to the website ipcinfo.org, you can access not only the latest report, but all the previous ones. They're very technical documents, and you can judge for yourself. And they make clear that they are using exactly the same criteria that they have used elsewhere. That as a rule, no assessment provided by the FRC that is subsequently endorsed by the IPC is based on comprehensive information because of the conditions in which these famines generally take place. And in addition to that, we have the independent assessment of a specialist named Jeremy Konendek, if I pronounce his surname correctly. He was a former senior official at USAID and is now the president of Refugees International. He has written a number of very detailed and well informed posts on social media in which he points out that this is a red herring, that in fact the assessments used to determine famine in the Gaza Strip are exactly the same criteria, the exact same methods that were used earlier this year to determine famine in Sudan and previously in South Sudan and elsewhere. So, what you essentially have is a very authoritative report written by, produced by leading specialists in the field, endorsed by the world's leading authority on these issues. And the Israeli response is, don't ignore this. It's all anti Semitism, it's blood libel. And what these people have done is basically completely overhauled the criteria for the purpose of making Israel look bad. And then specialists who were not involved in this have looked at these reports in detail. It says actually they've used exactly the same criteria. They've used exactly the same cautionary notes in approaching the subject, and their conclusion is incredibly sound, and there is absolutely no reason to doubt any of their statements or assessments, and of course the IPC report also makes the point that famine is not something that is only judged retroactively. In other words, it's not required to enter a territory after the famine is concluded, count the number of bodies, and then say, oops, there was a famine. No, it's an ongoing process, and therefore immediate intervention is required. And here again, we need to point out that the issue in the Gaza Strip is not drought, it's not crop failure, it's not the lack of rapid availability of of the goods and food and so on needed to put an end to this famine. Everything that is required to end this famine is sitting literally within spitting distance of the Gaza Strip. And the reason it's there is, as everyone who is involved in this aid effort has noted, is because Israel prohibits the entry of these goods, and because Israel prevents the professional organizations that are required to competently do this work. It prevents them from operating and has instead transferred all of their activities to the death squad known as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has managed to which has managed to set the context for the killing of more Palestinians than perhaps in any similar aid operation this century.
And then follow up to that, you mentioned the GHF. I think we are in a state of paralysis in the sense that usually when the UN classifies a famine, there'll be many different agencies and organizations that will be mobilized. It triggers so many projects to deliver aid. But I guess in this scenario, we are in a state of paralysis because the agency that is committing or responsible for the famine is also trying to deliver the aid to prevent the famine. So, speak a little bit about this paralysis that we find ourselves in. It's quite a unique situation where the UN has declared famine. Now, then what? The usual steps that would be taken to ease the famine cannot be taken because the agency which has caused the famine is also responsible now for delivering the aid to stop the famine. So what do we do now?
Well, exactly. I mean, I can't recall if it was in this particular report or another one where the point is made that the GHF is not, in fact, a humanitarian agency, that the GHF is simply incapable of addressing the problem that its sponsors and supervisors in Israel have deliberately created. I mean, you have leading world authorities like Alex Deval saying that this is the most minutely engineered famine on record. And yes, it's you to address these issues, you need professional organizations with experience, with expertise, with capacity. But Israel has essentially col- collectively banned them from operating because famine is a policy objective. Famine is precisely what Israel is seeking to create. I mean, when you have a state that is in full and absolute control of a territory and determines everything to the minutest degree, you can't then credibly claim that the outcome is contrary to the policy of the state that is pursuing these policies. It just, it makes absolutely no sense. And of course, the GHF death squad, this Israeli American project, has been there to first of all, to weaponize aid, to put aid in the service of Israel's strategic objectives with regard to the Gaza Strip and its Palestinian population, but secondarily, also to serve as a kind of camouflage, so that, every time people see emaciated children reduced to skin and bones, and the previous Hasbara talking point that these people have pre-existing conditions and therefore they somehow deserve to die. When that no longer flies, you begin to see these statistics pulled by GHF out of thin air. Today we delivered 75 million meals. Yesterday we delivered enough food to the Gaza Strip to feed all of Asia for 16 months. A complete hoax. But the key issue is that Israel, as a matter of policy, is preventing the professional agencies that are specialized in addressing these crises from operating. And it is doing so because what we're seeing on our screens and what Israeli leaders are also saying is this is precisely the intended outcome in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, and I mentioned attempts to discredit the organization or claims about starvation. And one of the ways they've done this, Israeli Hasbara goons, I would say, is to push out this statement saying, for example, this child starved only because they have pre-existing conditions, as though this is some kind of a gotcha, question. How can this be an example or instance of starvation when this child is already suffering from some other illness? But that's precisely how starvation
Yeah.
works. That's how famine works. The weak and the vulnerable are usually the ones who die
Precisely.
first, and then it makes its way up to the healthier uh, individual. So I found some of the so-called, the gotcha response to this really revealing as to
Yeah.
how detached they are from reality and also any lack of empathy and humanity. I mean, just get your thoughts on
Well,
some of those
yeah.
responses.
Well, imagine that your propaganda efforts have become so desperate that you're basically saying, this child has cerebral palsy, this child has this or that pre-existing condition. So why are you even making an issue out of this child starving to death? It's blood libel,
Yeah.
uh, yes, there's this kind of argument that if you can find even one person in the Gaza Strip who is not reduced to skin and bones, then you have absolutely no right to say there is starvation in the Gaza Strip, let alone famine. I'm not going to I'm not going to present the precise criteria used by the IPC to determine famine because I don't want to make any mistakes in doing so, and it's not my area of specialization. But these are set out very clearly in the IPC report. Again, ipcinfo.org. And basically, the idea that there's no famine until everyone drops dead is a complete fabrication. And precisely as you mentioned, and as anyone who has ever worked in this field will tell you, as with epidemic disease and other issues, it's those who are most vulnerable to the effects of the policy who suffer its impact first and most severely. And of course, in the case of infants who don't have pre-existing conditions, well, their only pre-existing condition is that they need milk from their mothers, and their mothers are sufficiently malnourished that they can no longer produce milk. Their other pre-existing condition is that in the absence of mother's milk, they need baby formula, and Israel is has a strict policy of preventing the entry of baby formula into the Gaza Strip. We have seen incidents reported of baby formula being literally confiscated from foreign volunteer doctors entering the Gaza Strip. Yeah, sure, that's a pre-existing condition. Children who don't have teeth can't eat dried lentils or pasta. So, the level of depravity that Israeli propaganda has reached, I think, really indicts itself, and it also explains why, even within traditionally pro-Israeli constituencies, people are beginning to have second thoughts about not only Israel's policies, but about the Israeli project itself. And also, I think, helps explain their increasingly desperate, outlandish conspiracy theories that they resort to seek to justify Israel and its policies.
And I think as we later in the show, we'll discuss how the propaganda lines, no one's believing them anymore because it's just so obvious and it's so clear to anyone who's an ounce of sympathy. They can see exactly what's going on. But before we do that, I wanted to, of course, I mean, starvation is just one part of the picture. There is also the big story of the number of people, Palestinian civilians, Palestinian civilians that have been killed by Israel throughout the past 2 years. Nearly, Israel has continuously tried to discredit the figures that have been coming out from Gaza. Currently, it stands at something like 63,000. The numbers could be much higher, according to many journals, like Lancet, for example. It could reach as high as 183,000. So we don't really know. Um, but last week, Israel's own figures, which were leaked, showed that 83% of those that are killed are civilians. And that kind of undermines Israel's own narrative, which means that 5 out of 6 Palestinians that have been killed, murdered in Gaza are civilians. They're not militants, they're not Hamas, which would put the casualty figures in Gaza up there, with the Srebrenica genocide, where not as high as, for example, Rwanda genocide, where it's something like 93%, but it's really up there, really, really high. So just get your thoughts on that, and what does it tell us about Israel's conduct in the way it's been going about its campaign in Gaza?
Well, I think this was another very important scoop by the Israeli journalist and filmmaker Yuval Abraham, writing for 972 magazine. And this report was published in association with another, I believe, Israeli outlet named Local Call and the British Guardian. Abraham seems to have successfully cultivated a number of sources within the Israeli security establishment. And what what he what his latest very thoroughly documented report reveals is that according to Israeli military intelligence, only approximately 7,000 of the 63,000 Palestinians who have been killed since October 2023 are confirmed to be Hamas or Islamic Jihad militants, with an additional 1,500 Palestinians presumed but not definitively confirmed to be militants of Hamas or Islamic Jihad combatants. Now, this is important for several reasons. First of all, as you know, um, the BBC's management, the New York Times, and others have basically been on a 2 year long campaign to undermine and destroy the credibility of the Gaza Health Ministry. You know, there are constant references to it as the Hamas-run health ministry, trying to present it basically as a propaganda outfit. They've been doing so as a service to Israel, as a service to the Gaza genocide, while we now learn that Israeli military intelligence, which is a repository of all this information, in fact uses the data provided by the Gaza Health Ministry because it considers them very reliable. So imagine you have a situation where the BBC is campaigning constantly to undermine the credibility of an organization that the beneficiaries of the BBC's propaganda campaign, Israel, consider to be thoroughly reliable. That's the first point. Second point is that, of course, Israel's flunkies and apologists immediately responded, well, just because Israel has confirmed that only, what is it, 15 or 20% of the casualties are combatants, doesn't mean that all the others are by definition civilian non-combatants. Well, no, that's not how it works. And because what, first of all, Israel, the Gaza Strip rather, has been the most intensively surveyed territory over the course of several decades. And Israel has a database of all members of the Hamas and Islamic Jihad armed wings. Now, of course, it's entirely possible that there are other Palestinian fighters, as the report points out, who are not members of either Hamas or Islamic Jihad, or are not known members of an armed group in the Gaza Strip, and therefore don't enter the database. But that would be only a small percentage, and wouldn't really materially change the conclusions reached in this report. In addition to that, it also points out that um, Israel has indiscriminately targeted members of the civilian government in the Gaza Strip, of the political wing of Hamas, of its social welfare network, and so on, and that these cannot be considered combatants under any conventional definition of the term. So That's why the report says at least 83%. And it could be, I think the report says as high as 86% or even more so. Um, and then, of course, what is also so interesting about this report is that a number of the sources who spoke to Abraham said, you know, all these estimates that you've seen coming from Israeli leaders and politicians and military spokesmen over the past year, you know, one day they claim they've killed 20,000 Palestinian militants. Then the following week they say 12,000, and they provide numbers that are all over the place. Basically, Abraham was told, you can take all these with a grain of salt. You trust them at your peril, and you should discard them because the only reliable data, Israeli data, on how many Palestinian combatants Israel believes has killed since October 2023 are from this military intelligence database.
I mean, I want to I'm framing it in this way. It may sound controversial. I mean, if you apply Israel's logic and thinking into this, I mean, what does it matter? As they said, Gaza is controlled by Hamas. If or those who live in Gaza are sympathetic to Hamas, or the children they'll grow up to be Hamas. It's all Hamas. So what does it really matter? So if you play Israel's logic out, 83%, it's not really it. Which is why when it's leaked to you and I and the rest of the world, it seems shocking, the death to civilian and militant casualties. Death, sorry. But in the Israeli public, it doesn't really matter because Gaza is, of course, as I mentioned, the categories: Hamas, or sympathetic to Hamas, or those who are going to grow up to become Hamas. And in this kind of genocidal mania, which we spoke about in many shows, it doesn't really matter as far as they're concerned. But of course, the international community, the rest of the world, does care, and they are concerned that 83% of those that are killed are in the rate of Srebrenica genocide and almost reaching Rwanda genocide.
Yes, I mean, you know, genocidal mania is precisely the correct term. I mean, and the issue here, of course, is I guess theoretically, you could have a very high proportion of civilian casualties if you could demonstrate that these were, you know, as it's so odiously called, collateral damage as a result of particularly intense urban combat or what have you. But in Gaza, of course, the situation is entirely different. You, for example, had or have this Israeli artificial intelligence program known as Lavender and Where's Daddy? I mean, imagine Where's Daddy, that were designed to kill people on its kill list along with their entire families, sometimes along with every other occupant of that building. And I think what this report demonstrates quite clearly is that the target of Israel's military operations are not only Hamas or Islamic Jihad or members of other armed groups. The premeditated, deliberate target of Israel's genocidal military campaign is the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip itself as a whole, without distinction.
Mm. Yeah, and on top of the huge death toll of civilians, there's also the kind of people Israel is choosing to target and assassinate. Last week, we spoke about Anas al-Sharif, along with three of his colleagues, Al Jazeera colleagues, who were assassinated by Israel. This week, there was another incident yesterday. We're recording this on a Tuesday, so I guess it would have been, Monday.
Monday, yeah.
Israel again murdered five journalists along with 20 others in a strike on Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunus. Um, so and what I found quite shocking now, I guess, is expected. Journalists in Gaza Strip are now shutting down their social media accounts because of fear that they will be targeted by Israel. So it's quite a, you know, really shocking place to be in, where Israel is probably checking social media to see who's active, who's not, and then going after and targeting those journalists like the ones we saw yesterday and before.
Yes, I mean, Israel is waging a systematic campaign of annihilation against the media in the Gaza Strip. I mean, as we've discussed before, more journalists and reporters have been killed in the Gaza Strip during the past 2 years than have in all armed conflicts in recent decades combined. This is a systematic policy, as with the case of Anas al-Sharif, which we discussed last week. He and his colleagues were not killed because they got caught in crossfire covering an exchange of fire in eastern Jabalia. They were deliberately bombed with premeditated intent in their press tent on the grounds of Al Shifa Hospital. And, Israel immediately, and when Israel immediately says, we murdered this individual because he was a terrorist commander in a press vest. Well, what more evidence do you need that Israel knew exactly what it was doing and did what it did because it knew exactly what it was doing? So here you have another incident. Um, Israel bombs a part of Al Nasser Hospital, the last functioning hospital in Khan Yunis, um, bombs it in order to kill a journalist and kills a number of other people along with him. Um, then a number of reporters and aid workers uh, rush to the scene, either to help or to report. And then 15 minutes later, a second missile is fired at exactly the same spot in order to kill those who were there. And of course, one cannot claim that Israel had no idea what it was doing. Of course, it knew exactly what it was doing. It had eyes on everything that it was doing. Now, what was telling is that the bombs had barely exploded, and the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra, led by a particularly vile propagandist known as David Collier, who's a favorite of BBC management, um,
UK based.
yes, immediately began putting out, that these people, Israel has mountains of intelligence on these people, they're all terrorists and so on. And the whole orchestra began playing this symphony, which, in unison, kind of right on cue, which shows that the propaganda to justify this atrocity had all been prepared. The only problem is it was all caught live on camera, and the images were so shocking that several hours later, um, uh, Israel's wanted war criminal, Prime Minister Netanyahu, came out and had to present this as a mishap and had to apologize for an inadvertent
Well, he
mistake.
called it tragic mishap.
Tragic mishap.
Yeah.
So basically, threw all his flunkies under the bus. So, how can you say, yes, this is exactly what needed to happen because we have files on these people, and say, actually, they weren't our target at all. It was all an accident. And now, according to Israel's Channel 14, the Israeli military unit that conducted this atrocity is now up in arms and demanding that Netanyahu apologize for calling it a mishap because they want credit for this atrocity and talk about genocidal mania. But let's be clear, there's a systematic campaign of annihilation being waged by Israel against the media in the Gaza Strip. It began with journalists and reporters and media workers who work for Palestinian media organizations. It was supported or it wasn't opposed, and people pretended it didn't happen. So it then moved on to Arab media. Most recently, as we discussed last week, um, uh, the murder of what had become the most prominent remaining journalist in the Gaza Strip, Anas al-Sharif. Um, there were some words of criticism, of condemnation, but essentially, the message was sent to Israel loud and clear, uh, business as usual, don't worry, we have your back. So they're now moving on to reporters who work for international news organizations, the Associated Press, Reuters, and so on. And in a particularly despicable incident, the Associated Press report on these killings wouldn't even name its own freelancer, wouldn't even give his name as one of those killed. And then the New York Times, um, in its reporting on this incident, said it's unclear what the target was. I think it was Ryan Grimm of Dropsite
Yes.
who said, well, we've now entered a new era of journalism. A US B 52 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. We're still trying to figure out what the target was. So the 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 Western legacy media, mainstream media, their complicity and their enabling of this genocide has really, I mean, they reach new lows with every passing week. Um, but even then, you would think that at least they would have a modicum of respect and solidarity with their own profession, with their own colleagues. But they're even campaigning effectively for the systematic annihilation of the media in the Gaza Strip. I mean, they will leave no stone unturned in order, all the reports, of course, begin with Israel says. Um, it's really beyond words the extent to which mainstream Western media's investment in the Israeli genocide has become so intense that they are also effectively complicit in the systematic annihilation of their own profession, of their own colleagues in the Gaza Strip.
Now, I want to speak to you also about the situation in the occupied West Bank. It was part of my list to discuss last week. We didn't have time and a couple of other topics. But before I do that, there is another important report which I want to get your thoughts on. It's by the Palestinian Prisoners Society. And they've issued a really shocking report titled Enduring Hell: Gaza Detainees Face Severe Israeli Torture Behind Bars. So this is referring to the detention center in Ramla prison and Teiman, which we've spoken about before, and it's the notorious prison where Palestinians from Gaza were held, where Palestinian prisoners were raped and tortured. So there's another report that was published, and and it documented, as I said, horrific abuse. Spoke to the lawyers, spoke to the detainees. Um, so just get your views on that and some of the revelations from that. I guess it's quite consistent with what we've been hearing for
Yeah.
many months and before that as well.
Well, when you consider that Abu Ghraib, the notorious U.S. torture camp in Iraq, that it benefited, quote unquote, from the expertise of the Israeli intelligence and the Israeli prison service, that Israel, to a significant extent, served as a model. That gives you an idea of what's going on here. It's a combination of physical torture, of trying to destroy captives psychologically, and so on. And what we have now is a report with, you know, um, prisoners being warned before they meet with their lawyers on those occasions where they are permitted to meet with their lawyers, not to provide any information about their treatment. And this report speaks, for example, of one prisoner trying to convey information with eye movement so that he doesn't have to speak anything, doesn't have to say anything. Captives that have been totally destroyed physically and psychologically, who are permitted 20 minutes of exercise every other day, who are put on a starvation diet, who are constantly physically tortured, and so on. I mean, you know, I'll leave it to your imagination because
Mm.
what's happening in these torture centers exceeds our ability to imagine. You actually have to read these reports to get an understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, well, I guess we can refocus this question and look at some of the other historical examples. You mentioned Abu Ghraib. Um, we know there's enough document out there, studies out there to show that the creation of Daesh, ISIS, for example, was really the creation of the American-run uh, prison systems in Iraq and then also in Syria, which was also supported by the Americans to hold ISIS fighters in those prisons. And people who are tortured and abused, they come out of these prisons and they become, I'm not saying the Palestinians will, but you can see the destruction of a society, of a nation, uh, is can partly come about as a result of the treatment they receive in prisons. We have, as I said, ISIS is an example, but it's creating conditions for ongoing suffering, ongoing violence, because you are basically breaking a generation of mainly men in this case, who after they leave from suffering all this torture and abuse, what are we creating? And in the case of Iraq and Syria, we saw ISIS, Daesh. What are we creating here in Palestine? I'm not saying it's going to be the same result, but definitely the attempt seems to be an effort to destroy a generation of young men. So they return and they have no way of contributing to society. Broken men, and it's a long story.
Yes. Well, the situation is actually somewhat different in the sense that the Israeli prison system has often been referred to as Palestine Open University, in the sense that Israel over the years has had such a phenomenally high rate of incarcerating Palestinians, including very large numbers of Palestinians who were not politically active or were not involved in any organization, that it was in the Israeli prison system that they were mobilized and recruited and educated and activated, if you will, by their fellow prisoners who did have an organizational or political background. And I think what we're seeing now is an effort by Israel to prevent a recurrence of such a process by ensuring, for example, that so many prisoners are kept in permanent solitary confinement and so on, and ensuring that the only Palestinians who emerge from Israel's gulag emerge as thoroughly broken individuals, physically and psychologically, of people who, regardless of what they may feel, are simply incapable of participating in Palestinian society and political life in the future. That's the theory as far as Israel is concerned. But I don't see how it's going to work because, as you mentioned, it produces so much determination, rage, and the desire to be rid of this vicious occupier that it's very likely to once again backfire.
Mm. Let's turn our attention to the occupied West Bank, where, according to some commentators, the stage is being set for a second genocide. Um, and those comments were made in reference to another illegal settlement, the E1 settlement that's being constructed. Um, this is seen as kind of a doomsday scenario where if Israel proceeds with the construction of the E1 settlements, that would be the end of the two-state solution if it wasn't already. So let's. What's your thoughts on that and details of Israel's attempts to now move forward with the construction of the E1 settlements, which over the decades they've basically parked. They never really moved forward with this, but now they seem to be pushing ahead with Smotrich and others.
Mm.
So let's get your thoughts on that.
Well, first, just on two-state settlement, I don't think the E1 settlement plan or anything else Israel does in the West Bank necessarily spells the end of the two-state settlement, because a two-state settlement is taken off the table by the lack of political will by Israel's sponsors and allies, and their determination to ensure that Israel can annex these territories with impunity and will not need to reverse any of the facts it establishes on the ground. That's why we can no longer realistically speak of any two-state settlement. And I think the E1 plan is a perfect example. The E1 settlement plan was first devised by Israeli planners, I believe, in the 1980s. And it connects Ma'ale Adumim, one of the main, if not the largest, Israeli settlement in the West Bank, which lies between Jerusalem and Jericho, and connects it to Jericho. In other words, it will become a territory free of Arabs for the exclusive use of Israelis, of Israeli Jews, or also foreign Jewish settlers. And it is effectively, I mean, when you look at the transportation routes and so on in the West Bank, it effectively bisects the West Bank. And if it's not reversed, you can't have a meaningful Palestinian state in the West Bank. And of course, the Israelis speak about this openly, that it is being built precisely for that purpose. Now, when it was first proposed in the 1980s, the West, European states, even at the time, including the United States, were very clear that they considered E1 a red line, that if Israel went ahead with this, there would be consequences. And Israel was given a clear red light, no, you will not do this. And so it was shelved. And every once in a while, every few years, Israel would take some measure to bring it closer to reality. If it got warned, it would back off. If it wasn't warned, it would proceed one more step. Now comes the main initiative to bring E1 to fruition, precisely for the reasons stated. And entirely as expected, what we've learned is that the red line turned out to be a very, very, very bright green light. The message from Brussels came loud and clear: do whatever the hell you want. Nothing, absolutely nothing, will ever get in the way of business as usual. You are our favorite child. That's all that matters.
Mm. And we should point out, Germany said that they will not recognize a Palestinian state, even though there's been a move over the past couple of weeks. UK, Australia, Canada, and others. Germany came out just recently saying that they will not recognize a Palestinian state. And the UK, of course, again showed its hypocrisy on the one hand, saying they will recognize a Palestinian state. But this week it was revealed that they will be giving Israel's weapons manufacturer, Elbit Systems, 2 billion contract to train British soldiers. So on the one hand, I mean, it seems like there is really no um, option on the table, or no desire to make Israel pay for any of its crimes, and despite the words of condemnation, despite verbal threats, there is nothing effective. If you're going to give 2 billion contracts on the one hand, while at the same time saying, condemning Israeli genocide, I don't see how that can in any way be seen as being a serious policy towards a country that's committing genocide. Let's end, I guess. I had a few other questions in mind, but I don't want to dwell on some of the other issues. I want to get your thoughts on a tweet you issued just a couple of days ago. And I think it's important because it kind of frames our discussion, many of our discussions, within this narrative of erasing Palestine. You see that a lot. I think just the other day, some British commentator by the name of Melanie Phillips, she came out and said that the Palestinian flag in the eyes of the Israelis is no different to the Nazi flag. We associate the Palestinian flag with the Nazi flag, and it's just, it's
Imagine how people now look at the Israeli flag.
yeah, of course, yeah. And I think, and your tweet kind of summed up kind of highlighted the way in which this erasure is taking place. You showed how from the time of Herodotus, Palestine as an entity was always recognized, and it was known for more than nearly 4 millennium. So why is this debate important today? Okay, why did you feel the need to issue this? And I guess we know there is an ongoing attempt to erase Palestine. If there was a similar attempt to erase another nation, another country in this manner, of course, would say this is genocidal language. But we see that every single day, even on the BBC, people like Phillips and others will come on and say, what Palestinians? These are just manufactured, created constructions. There's
It's
no such thing
fake.
as a Palestinian. It's fake.
Pa-
So, yes, talk about your tweet and we'll end on that.
Look, Palestine, according to the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra, Palestine not only doesn't exist, it has never existed. There is no such thing as a Palestinian people, as Golda Meir famously said in 1969. And so this is really all much ado about nothing. And you know what? Um, the noted author William Dalrymple was recently interviewed at a I believe at a literary festival in Scotland, and when he was asked about this, I thought he gave a brilliant answer. He said, I had always assumed, he says, that Palestine was a term that first came to be applied to this region by the British in the context of their mandate. But when I looked into this, I discovered that Palestine is as old as literacy itself, pointing out that Herodotus in the 5th century BCE already referred to Palestine as the territory between Phoenicia and Egypt. And, um, yes, of course, there was in the Iron Age, there was a kingdom of Judah, and according to some historians, there was also a united kingdom of Judah and Israel, according to other historians. That's an article of faith rather than history. But, Palestine has always existed. From Herodotus to the present day, it is a name that has been consistently applied to this territory. So, just to give another example, you know, um, now Israel flunkies like putting up a coin from the British Mandate where it says Palestine in English, Palestine in Arabic, and according to them, the Hebrew lettering on that phrase is land of Israel. Well, no, what it says in Hebrew is Hebrew for Palestine, and then within parentheses, it has the abbreviation of Land of Israel. In other words, it is Palestine, and then in parentheses, secondarily, also known to some people as Land of Israel. But it's this idea, that it has been Israel since the time of the dinosaurs, that it has only ever been populated by Jews. That even in the 18th century, all of Russia and Poland and Lithuania's Jews were actually living in Hebron. All this kind of total nonsense, this determination not to rewrite history, but to erase history, to pretend reality never existed, so that you can then construct an entirely alternate reality that is supposed to somehow justify your genocidal apartheid and claims to exclusivity. No community, no people, no ethnicity, no religion has ever had exclusive possession or ownership of Palestine, whether Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Arab, whatever. It has always been a cauldron of interaction. And I thought in his interview, William Dalrymple explained this very well. Yes, there, you know, there has always been a stable population in Palestine, but it was never shut off from the outside world. Conquerors, pilgrims, settlers, whatever you want, came and went. And it's really only in the 20th century that this entire population was uprooted, dispossessed, forced into exile, replaced by another population that was overwhelmingly born elsewhere, and who now claimed exclusive eternal hegemony over this land. It's it's beyond words, and to think that there's a serious argument being made that somehow Palestine, in contrast to all the countries, all the territories around it, in contrast to Lebanon, to Syria, to Jordan, to Iraq, to Egypt, was somehow unpopulated at the 19th century. I mean,
I mean, even that you point this out as well, even the documents which the Israelis rely upon to
yes,
justify their claim,
yeah,
Balfour Declaration, Jewish homeland in Palestine,
yes. No, it doesn't mention Israel. Yeah,
yeah, and the UN partition plan of Palestine. So
exactly.
so even the very documents which they rely
Yeah,
upon mentions Palestine even before the state of Israel. So I guess, but they don't see that well, they choose not to see what's clearly in front of their face. And on that, if people are interested, it's worth reading Nur Musalha's book, Palestine, a 4,000-year history, documents how Palestine has been always a territory known to its neighbors and others since, as you mentioned, since Herodotus all the way down to the modern time. But it's the only place where no Palestinians existed, even though Palestine has been around for 4,000 years. Strange way to, well, strange logic. If you don't have anything further to add, Moin, we could conclude
yeah,
now. Yeah,
that's
okay.
fine.
Thank you so much,
Thank
and
you, as
see you
always.
next week. And thank you for tuning in. And please remember to like and share our podcast. See you next week. Bye bye.